Crisis Theory panel sponsored by Marxist-Humanist Initiative. This panel will explore the causes of the Great Recession and the continuing economic sluggishness since the recession's end, as well as how the left can respond to this situation. The first of the three panelists is going to be Alan Freeman. Alan Freeman is co-editor with Radhika Desai of the Future of World Capitalism book series, and with Andrew Kliman, another panelist, of a new journal, Critique of Political Economy. He is currently a visiting professor at London Metropolitan University. He has written or edited 4 books and numerous articles on economics, politics, and culture.
I have to find get the slideshow going. Does the man see it? Am I in the correct?
Here. Yes, right there.
Yes.
You're good.
I should get a prize of some sort.
Is there a microphone?
Oh,
No microphone?
can you, if I just speak up like this, will that be okay?
That's helpful, and I look at watch your lips too.
Okay, so this is good enough for everybody. If you don't get it, you can watch the video.
Alan, I'll give you a time cue in 15
How long
minutes.
is it? 15?
20 minutes total.
Oh, right, okay, I should be done there. Now, what I always do now, because I'm finding that I, get cut short by very good chairs, like the chair we have here, is I always put a slide up first saying where you can find this if I don't finish, okay? And the place you're going to find it is that top link, slideshare.net. I put all my slides up there, and for some reason they gave me the name Alan Freeman 777. I suspect that's because 666 was taken. He has 666, right? We both call ourselves in signatures AX, which is short for Antichrist, because everybody hates us. But anyway, when you do that, then you'll see all the other links there, which will enable you to get to the stuff that I'm going to reference during this talk. And if all else fails, you can Google Alan Freeman, and when you've got through all the links to a disc jockey called Alan Freeman, you'll get to me. So that's where to find it. I'm going to begin with 4 graphs about the profit rate. I'm not actually going to do much talking about what these mean, because I've written articles about them, which you can read. What I'm going to do is try and assess why, even though the articles with these graphs in them have been available for a considerable amount of time, and even though the fact that they are available means that there are a series of things that basically don't stand up to examination that are said by academics, nevertheless Marxist academics continue to say them. So what I'm going to be discussing, and this was the sort of remit I was given by the organisers, is why the left doesn't get it right. That was the title of the talk. And I'm going to argue that the left, on a whole, the academic left, is stuck in a groove of reasoning and arguing in ways that don't allow it to get at the truth. So I'm going to be talking about how to get at the truth, what goes wrong and what might go right. Now the first 2, the top row, refer to a calculation that I mentioned in the previous discussion. A very simple calculation about what the profit rate is, and I experimentally, hypothetically, but when with argument behind it, suggested that you need to include financial assets in the denominator of the profit rate. Because banking assets actually function as capital in the sense they compete with other potential investments for a share of the profit rate, for a share of profits, and in consequence, if you're expanding financial assets, even though there is a duplication because they're debt assets, they're a second claim on a fixed asset, nevertheless, that brings the profit rate down. I discovered that if you make this correction for the US profit rate, there is no recovery in the profit rate whatsoever. It just continues down. But also I discovered that it corrects an extraordinary anomaly. in the way that people discuss the profit rate. And the anomaly is, on the right-hand side, it's the UK profit rate. If you measure the UK profit rate in the way that most Marxists do, using fixed assets as the denominator, you find it went through an extraordinary recovery in 1974. And there's no ambiguity. With the US profit rate, there's all sorts of arguments and discussions. I think Andrew has made the very correct point, which I agree with. You have to use historical instead of current cost capital, and that makes a difference. If you look at the UK profit rate, there is absolutely no question that it recovers on any measure whatsoever. That conflicts everything else we know about the UK economy. Because it is basically the worst economy in Europe, except possibly now Greece. All the other indicators show that it went into systematic decline from which it never recovered in 1974. So you explain with this theory a fact which the other theories can't explain. What do I think is wrong about the way that this gets treated in the literature? Well, first of all, most people write about the profit rate ignoring this finding, which I think is thoroughly unscientific. You have something that refutes a theory if it were true and you pay no attention to it. But second, people still use words like the profit rate. But if you have a number of different possible ways of conceptualizing the profit rate, you are not entitled to use the word the profit rate, because there is no agreement amongst scholars as to how that is to be defined. You have to say my measure of the profit rate, or his measure, or her measure of the profit rate, or Deloitte Touche's measure of the profit rate. You cannot refer to the profit rate, but people keep on doing it, which should send a warning signal. The second set of graphs dates back to 2006. This is one of the most downloaded and linked to and clicked on article that I've written. So it's very well known, it gets cited, and it simply asks whether you can explain the fall that did happen in the US profit rate, up till you get to the possible uptick, best by the accumulation of capital or by a change in the profit share. And the first graph I'll just show you, this line here is the profit share, this line is the profit rate. This line does not really explain that line. This is what I call the maximum profit rate, that's the grey line there. That's what you would get if wages were zero. And this more or less perfectly, except for what was a real significant attack on the working class in 1965, when there was a change in the profit share. It just shows it has much better explanatory value. But people still continue to use, first of all, words like profits and profitability as if they meant the same thing, which they do not. One is a ratio, the other is a quantity. One affects what capital does, the other does not, because capital is driven to seek the highest rate of return, not the highest quantity of profits. So it's going to have a considerable impact on the way we think about profits. Yet, again, it is systematically ignored. I might as well not have written it as regards the way that most Marxists discuss the profit rate and profits. Now, I think that shows there's a problem with the way that Marxists reason. And I'm now going to recount a short and somewhat irate exchange with a very good friend of mine 3 days ago. My very good friend, Heisig, wrote to me and said, I'm very favourably inclined in the direction of Gindin's article. He sent me a link. I read it. I was a bit tired and slightly annoyed, and I said, thank you for sending me an article that is so profoundly wrong in every single respect that it provides all the material I need for my Sunday talk at the Left Forum. Then he writes back and he said, glad to be of service, but I'll take you to be talking about academic arcana and not politics on the street. And this is what I wrote back. By then I was really quite annoyed. And I wrote a heap of other stuff. Because truth is not something that is the special business of academics. Truth is the business of the working class. And it is the business of the working class by the classic definition of what the working class is. It is those people who have nothing to lose but their chains. That is, the only thing they've got is the sale of their labour power. And I just make a simple point that the sale of your power of labour includes your brain. Workers are not just a pair of hands. Workers think. And actually, if workers are going to change society, not only do they need to think, they need the truth. And they will get that truth in their own way. Not because somebody comes along and says, I am the giver of truth, receive it from me. And that is what I think is wrong with the way that most Marxists who are academic, just happen to be at this particular moment in history, go about talking. Now, a bit of my background, because this is a panel on evidence. I worked for 10 years for the Mayor of London, England. I was in charge of a unit which set the level of the living wage. Now, this has now become quite a big issue. I'm very much engaged in living wage battles in Canada. I've been an activist all my life. I talk to trade unionists, I talk to faith groups, I talk to activists, I talk to poverty people. And I tell you, people are passionately concerned about the method and evidence needed to set what the living wage ought to be, on the basis of a conception that it's what you need, given the cost of living, to be able to reproduce yourself, your family, bring yourself up in dignity. That's the concept. They're not prepared to leave that to experts. So that's my first example of where people are passionately concerned about evidence, because it's going to affect their living standards. I then, for what it's worth, worked on the data for the creative economy. I've done stuff on international equality and the Millennium Goals, a critique of the way those are calculated, and the work on long-run trends of the profit rate. So I'm a geek. I mean, I've done data all my life, and I'm very disturbed by the way that evidence is treated. Ratcheting up a notch from the living wage. In 2012, I attended with my partner Radhika Desai, who has written a wonderful book called Geopolitical Economy, which everybody should buy, plug. A wonderful discussion in South Africa, 2 months after a massacre in which 27 miners were shot, following a strike in the Platinum Belt, 20 miles from where we were meeting. Every single participant in the debates in the South African trade union movement was there, including the people who were being accused of organising the shooting, and the people who represented those who shot them. They discussed and discussed and discussed every single aspect of what was going on in South Africa, what was the role of the mining industry, what was the way that that women were being treated in South Africa, the environment. It was the highest level working class discussion I've ever attended. So why did you sit in a room with somebody that you think organised the shooting of your colleagues? Because truth is more important. And that gave birth to the current development within South Africa, where one of the biggest unions and most militant unions, NUMSA, under the leadership of a great guy called Irving Jim, but actually under the impulse of 1,400 shop stewards who met, considered all this evidence and decided that they were going to break from COSATU, is now taking a political initiative. And they need every possible access to all theories that they can get their hands on and all evidence they can to make up their minds, because lives are going to be affected by it. So truth is more important than having sectarian arguments for these people, for whom it counts. How do academics prevent that process occurring? And why do I not agree that academic arcana is something that's to be left to academics? 3 fundamental methods. Rhetoric. When you say, this is really silly because Andrew Kliman is trying to say that the health service is a great equalizer. That's not a logical argument. It sounds very convincing. You think, oh my God, this man is in favour of the American health service system. No, he's not. He's simply doing a work on the evidence to ask whether the effect of Medicaid is to offset, for some parts of society, some of the effects of lowering wages. It's an evidence question. But you deal with an evidence question by saying something very persuasive that is not actually a logical step from which you're not entitled to make a deduction. Ad hominem. Ad hominem is just basically, see, I don't trust this guy because, or I don't trust this person because, you know, she's an arsehole, or she's too argumentative, or, you know, how can you trust somebody who lives in that part of town, or belongs to this group? That's a very common argument. How can you trust somebody who belongs to this political group? There is no logical connection between how a person behaves and the truth of the idea that they're telling you about. Nobody says, I won't believe Einstein because, you know, he mistreated his brother or something like that. It's the idea of relativity that you have to judge, not the person. But economics in particular, but also, unfortunately, Marxists systematically attack each other in person instead of dealing with the ideas. And the third is misrepresentation. Simply not correctly saying what somebody says, which is probably one of the primary methods, which is why, you know, we, Andrew and myself, that's good, met over precisely the issue of the interpretation of Marx. It's been at the centre of the way that we think people should approach Marx, which is to go to the text and judge what Marx is saying on the basis of looking at a variety of interpretations. Absolutely fundamental. What's the objective of all these three tactics? It's what I call delegitimation. And this relates to a discussion that we were having earlier about the role of the sciences. And it relates to an argument that we put forward in 1996 when we wrote, Andrew and I, called Beyond Talking the Talk. And it was a call for systematic pluralism. Systematic pluralism simply says you have to look at the range of possible theories that are relevant to a decision you have to make about how to interpret the evidence, and that includes texts, in order to be able to come up with the best evaluation of what might be the most valid explanation on the basis of present knowledge. In my opinion, that is what the natural sciences, generally speaking, do. Okay, we can have a discussion about that. Economists don't. Academics don't. And on the whole, unfortunately, Marxists don't. What they do is they say, this one theory that I am presenting to you, neoclassical theory, or my reading of Marx, is the correct theory, and you should ignore all the others. That is, in my opinion, to completely confuse two different things. One is whether a theory is valid, that is, best explains the facts. The other is whether it's legitimate, which is whether it should be taken into consideration when judging validity. Very, very fundamental distinction. And the way that things go is they delegitimate theory. They say, let's rule that out of court. And let's not even think about whether financial assets should be included. Let's not even think about whether Andrew Kliman might be right. Let's not examine the evidence at all. Let's judge on who is the best guru. That's what delegitimation is about. Now, there is hope, and I'm now going to direct you to a number of places where I think things are beginning to change. There is a very large movement in the UK, which I hope people will become more aware of, which is student-led, for pluralism in economics teaching. There's an initiative which now has 46 different associations in about 26 countries signing up. If you haven't signed up, sign up. If your students haven't signed up, sign them up. If your professors haven't signed up, get them to sign up. Because it's demanding what I think is a fundamental need. The need to have a variety of theories, a variety of explanations made available to students, and in my opinion, made available to the working class, so they themselves can autonomously make up their minds about the issue at stake, instead of simply being told in the way that a preacher or a priest or a guru tells you. The next one is this took us 8 years to prepare, a special issue of the Cambridge Journal of Economics on Whig history and the reinterpretation of economics. 8 articles from 8 completely different viewpoints, it has to be said, all about how economics, since a program that was launched by Samuelson in 1976, I think, called which actually said that economics should adopt what he calls the Whig historical method, which basically means you don't need to look at anything except the theory that you now hold. You don't need to look at the past, and you reinterpret past thinkers as imperfect forms, imperfect versions of your current theory. That's what economics basically does. We don't need to study Marx because we know he's wrong because we got to where we are now. Okay? That's how it works. This is a systematic antidote to this. Now, this is actually free to download until July the 1st. And a wonderful stroke of marketing genius and a great gift to the working class, or anybody who wants to get it, because once you get it, of course, well, I won't say the next step, I'm on video. But you can, it's free until July the 7th, and after that, get your libraries to subscribe to. Last thing, Facebook. In my opinion, the left and radical activists in general have really misunderstood what social media are. I think that social media are a real two-edged weapon. Because the way it's organized, with likes, shares, and all the rest, is it forms you into gangs. When you like something or share something, it's a substitute for thinking about it. You say, I'm part of a gang of people who agree with this person, and all we need to do is know who that person is. It's organized ad hominem. And so I've taken systematically to sharing on Facebook stuff I don't agree with. Right? And I invite all of you to put this disclaimer on your Facebook page. You'll be friends with me, you'll find it on my Facebook page, right? And I want to start a movement that says, against Facebook gang war. That we're going to stop doing this, you know, my guru is better than your guru stuff, and we're going to start thinking. That's it.
Okay, next up is Andrew Kliman.
Like about that chair, and maybe somebody can come and look for other chairs.
Are you going to use any computers?
Why should people be standing too passive among yourselves? Why don't you?
Yeah, sure.
Keep going.
I can't see the things. I got it. Am I anywhere near clicking this off?
You're on it.
Okay, good. I have a screen that doesn't function, so it's very weird.
Good.
Guesswork.
It's guesswork, yeah. Continue without Skype. That's it there.
There, click. Now you got it.
Okay. So, just by way of intro, Andrew Kliman is former professor of economics.
No, I'm
Current professor of economics and is the author of The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession, and Reclaiming Marxist Capital, A Refutation of the Myths of Inconsistency. He's the editor of a new Lexington book series, Heterodox Studies in the Critique of Political Economy, and many of his writings and talks on the economic crisis are at his website, akliman.squarespace.com/crisis hyphen intervention. So, Andrew Kliman.
Yeah, well, now
Take a seat.
this presentation will test your degree of agreement with Alan Freeman. What is really involved here, I mean, for me above all, is that I think that we have an economic crisis that is underlying it all a profitability crisis, and that Marx's law of the exponential fall of the rate of profit really helps to clarify why the Great Recession happened, why we're still in a period of stagnation, but a lot of very dominant beliefs, especially on the left and in liberal circles, about what's happened regarding income distribution, inequality, wages, allow folks to dismiss this law of the natural fall of the rate of profit and the idea of a profitability crisis, because supposedly, profits went up and so forth. So that's the context in which I wrote this. And the first part of what I'm going to talk about is an article of mine that was on the TruthDig site a couple of months ago, so I'll be able to talk about most of it, but it was called somebody really hogging workers' wages or something. Okay, so what if some of the most respected economists in the world told you that your pay is 40% lower than it would have been if it had increased in recent decades at the same rate as your productivity? If you're a typical American worker, that's how much the gap was in 2011, according to the Economic Policy Institute, a major liberal think tank. In its 2012 study, The State of Working America, EPI, Economic Policy Institute, reported that between 1973 and 2011, productivity, that one, increased by more than 80%, but hourly compensation of production and non-supervisory employees, regular employees, so to speak, that increased by less than 11%. And the EPI contended that this divergence of pay and productivity has meant that many workers were not benefiting from productivity growth. The economy could afford higher pay, but was not providing it. Prior to the Great Recession, though, just to set the stage, if we talk about average compensation of employees per hour, that did keep pace with productivity. Unless you measure compensation and productivity in highly misleading ways. Okay, so this graph here shows that the share of the net domestic product or output that U.S. employees received from 1970 until the start of the Great Recession, 2007, it was trendless, no upward trend, no downward trend in the employee compensation share, either in the corporate sector or in the larger, wider business sector. Okay, and so it follows from this immediately that on average then, employees' productivity increased just at the same pace as their compensation per hour, not more rapidly. Okay. Now, there's a problem here because not everyone is average. So the compensation of many workers did lag behind productivity to some degree. But it was misleading measurement that produced this graph, and you've seen many like that, I'm sure. The truth is, it just isn't the case that the economy could have afforded to close that supposed gap by increasing regular employees' compensation in tandem with their productivity, as these terms are defined by the EPI. To see this, let's just add the missing compensation and see what happens. Okay, so this next graph looks at how the income generated in production by businesses and nonprofits was divided up between 1972 and 2011. The blue part is the actual percentage paid for employees, and prior to the recession, it's just quite stable, which shows you that compensation was not, on average, declining compared with productivity, first of all. Okay, that's the blue. The orange area is some portions of the output that go to pay taxes, except for income tax, and various kinds of transfer payments like fines and stuff that businesses have to pay. The green part is interest payments that companies make and rental payments that they make. And the purple, that's the supposed missing compensation of the production non-supervisory workers. That's what was, according to the EPI, the missing 40% of typical workers' pay that they would have received if they had received the full benefits of their productivity growth, but they did not receive. Now, you see that this becomes a rising share of the total output. And it's 100% in 2001, 2007, 8, 9, you have more than 100% there, the sum of these four parts. Okay, and what that means is if the compensation of employees had kept pace with productivity, as defined by the EPI, then nothing, actually less than nothing, would have been left for the companies themselves. Corporate profit would have been negative. Incomes of self-employed people, people who have partnerships, like lawyers and stuff, okay, negative incomes they would have had. Okay, so I do not think it can be reasonably said that the economy could have afforded to close this productivity compensation gap. Okay, to continue with the same point, this next graph shows what would have happened to corporate profits and income of self-employed people and partners in law firms and stuff if that gap had been closed. The green is the actual incomes of the proprietors and the corporate profit as a share of national income in these sectors. Okay, basically more or less stable. Okay, but it would have declined precipitously their share of the output if the productivity compensation gap had been closed. Would have hit back basically 0, 2001, and 2007, 8, 9, it would have been negative. So that again says, this is not realistic. So where did the EPI go wrong? The problem has to do with the very peculiar way it adjusts productivity and compensation data in order to account for inflation. And you get this apple and oranges comparison. The numbers that the EPI uses to perform the adjustment, like everybody, they're called price indexes. Okay, and that tells you the average price of goods and services at a particular time, the price index number. Now, if the EPI had used a single price index to adjust productivity and to adjust compensation, to remove the inflation, it would have been comparing apples and apples. And it would not have obtained a productivity compensation gap that was so large and so misleading as the one that it did obtain. But what the EPI did was to use two different price indexes, one for productivity, one for compensation of employees. It did that to reflect the fact that the prices of the goods and services that workers buy have increased a good deal faster than the prices of goods and services that companies produce on average. And much of what the EPI considers to be a divergence of productivity and pay stems from the quicker growth of consumer prices, not from the slow growth of pay. So to make up for the particularly rapid inflation that workers experience and eliminate what the EPI regards as a divergence of pay and productivity, employees' compensation would have had to rise more rapidly than total income. And that's where you get all those weird problems that I was illustrating. Okay, so the share of income that employees receive would have eventually had to wipe out all profit and other business income. So it's reasonable to want statistics that reflect that particularly rapid inflation that workers, consumers have experienced. But the EPI's procedure produces lopsided growth of productivity compared to compensation in basically the same way that you could take a perfectly fine car and make it lopsided by deflating the left side tires a whole lot and the right side tires just a little. Okay, it wasn't lopsided to begin with, but deflate it differently on two sides, you get lopsidedness. Also, when two price indexes are used, you've got to be very careful about the implications here. Because when you use two different price indexes, a widening gap between productivity and compensation of employees does not mean that profits grew more quickly than productivity or that the profit share of net domestic product increased at the expense of the employee compensation share. Doug Henwood, editor of Left Business Observer, recently claimed that corporate profits skyrocketed, because productivity rose 93% between 1980 and 2013, while pay rose 38%. Okay, this is simply incorrect. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Okay, talks about extraordinarily lopsided economy, the extraordinarily lopsided growth he reports is produced by the same lopsided inflation adjustment that I was just talking about, like what the EPI does. As we've seen, the growth, the gap between the productivity, okay, the gap between the productivity and the compensation got bigger and bigger and bigger, but the employee compensation share, what the workers got as a share of what was produced, that did not decline at all. Okay, so empirical evidence indicates that U.S. corporations' rate of return on investment in fixed assets, their rate of profit, fell, never recovered in a sustained manner under neoliberalism from the early 80s onward. This suggests that Marx's theory of capitalist crisis may help a lot to explain why the Great Recession occurred and why the economy remains sluggish. But opponents of Marx's theory have frequently trotted out poorly understood income distribution data in order to challenge the evidence that the rate of profit fell and failed to rebound. Okay, as I've shown here, profit did not rise at the expense of employees' pay prior to the recession. So it should not be surprising that the rate of profit fell. So the attempt to dismiss the explanatory power of Marx's theory fails. But the opponents have until now always had a last-ditch argument. Okay, and here's the last-ditch argument. There really was a tremendous rise in profit at the expense of employees' pay, they say, but official statistics fail to reflect that rise because the official statistics wrongly count the salaries of top executives, CEOs, etc., as employee compensation. Okay, but what I'm about to show is that the available evidence strongly suggests that the rise in top executive salaries had extremely little effect. So the last-ditch attempt to dismiss the explanatory power of Marx's theory fails as well. Okay. So if, corporate executives were hogging workers' wages to a substantially greater degree, you could argue that the true profit share rose because the compensation received by top executives is arguably what the IRS calls disguised dividends. It's dividends, profit, disguised as compensation. Okay? It's not really payment for labor services, but it's a cut of the profits. This is a very popular suggestion. There's a closely related suggestion, which is that rising compensation received by the top echelon of salaried managers, that's supposedly the main driving force behind the rising share of income captured by the top 1% and 0.1%. This thesis has become more popular since the publication of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, in the 21st century. Okay, Piketty writes that the increase in very high incomes and salaries primarily reflects the advent of super managers, top executives of large firms who have managed to retain extremely high, historically unprecedented compensation packages for their labor. Okay? Recent research, he says, allows me to state that the vast majority of the top 0.1%, 1 in 1,000, of the income hierarchy in 2000-2010 consists of these top managers. So the new U.S. inequality has much more to do with the advent of super managers than with that of superstars. And he then goes on to say that in all the English-speaking countries, the primary reason for increased income inequality in recent decades is the rise of the super manager, top salaried executives, in both the finance and non-financial sectors. Now, this recent research to which Piketty refers is actually extremely important. It's a study by John Bakia out of called Radley Heim. But I think that Piketty has very seriously misinterpreted the study. What the authors actually found is that between 2001 and 2005, only 20% of those in the top 0.1% were salaried executives and managers and supervisors, except for financial professionals. Okay, Piketty says they were 60 to 70%. Okay? But, you know, they were only 20 if you look at the study that he's citing. 20 is very far from 60%. How are these the vast majority of people? Okay, how does Piketty come up with the 60% figure? He's referring to statistics that the authors produced that bundled together the salaried managers and executives, okay, with those who run businesses themselves, closely held businesses. These are owner managers, okay, very different group of people, not top corporate execs. And he's bundling in everybody in the finance category. So Piketty is bundling three things together, and he goes from 20% to 60%. Yeah, it is pretty serious. Okay? Now, these two groups of people, the salaried versus the closely held business, these are two entirely different groups. The authors of this study indicate that 94% of the combined labor and business income of the salaried group was labor income, wages and salaries. But of the closely held business group, the owner managers, 88% of their labor and business income was business income. Okay? In other words, income accruing to partners of partnerships, owners of S corporations, and stuff like that. And that's probably an understatement because these are tax returns, so you get spouses, you know, salaries might be there, and dependents and stuff. So it might be well over 88% of their income that's labor. Business income is business income, not labor income. These are not people being paid very, very, very high salaries. So what they receive is very high profits, business income, not extremely high compensation for their labor. And their income that they receive is therefore not dividends in disguise. Okay? It's not that the government statistics are counting this as employee compensation. No, they're counting it as what it is, business income. Okay? So when their share of total income rises, this closely held business thing of the owner managers, and it rose a hell of a lot according to this study, okay, that does not affect other employees' share of total compensation. Because these are not, you know, employees, okay? So the employee compensation figures are not affected when this closely held business category gets more and more and more pay. Okay. So if we wanted to determine whether the super managers, the top executives, or salary were getting more and more and more, we'd have to just count them. Executives, not executives' salary, manager's salary, supervisor's salary. Okay? And you see that, first of all, from 79 to 05, there ain't a hell of a lot of increase in their share. Okay? Now, that slightly undercounts the issue because we haven't yet included the people in finance. Okay? But how big was the rise? Okay, according to the data in this study, if you take these three things together, the share of income that they received was 0.39 percentage points, okay, between 79 and 05. And that implies that these folks' share of total output was just 0.31 percentage point higher in 2005 than what it would have been if it had remained constant at the 1979 level. Okay, now, what about the fact that these is just people who are non-finance? Well, I had to do an estimate, okay, to add in the finance people. So I added in a couple of groups. Financial managers, people like CFOs, and top executives of companies in the financial sector. And making adjustments to include these two groups, I estimated that the income share of these salaried execs, managers, supervisors, inclusive of finance, that rose by 0.84 percentage points instead of 0.39, and that implies that their share of output in 2005 was 0.67 percentage points higher, not 0.31 percentage points higher than it would have been if their share of income had been constant. Okay, now that's still extremely little. 2/3 of 1 percentage point. And that estimate kind of bends over backwards by assuming that all of these salaried managers in the top 1% are super managers who receive dividends that are disguised as employee compensation. That's more than a little bit of a stretch, since a married couple who each made $150,000 in 2005 and who had a kid who brought in $6,000, they would have actually qualified for the top 1%. This is not the picture of, super managers that you get from Piketty there. Okay, so the available evidence strongly suggests that the rise in top salaried executives' pay, okay, they're the ones who get the compensation, okay, that had extremely little effect on the distribution of output between profit and employee compensation. And so this means that the last-ditch attempt to dismiss the explanatory power of Marx's theory of the falling rate of profit, Marx's theory of prices, this last-ditch attempt also fails. Thank you.
Will, do you want to switch out now in 20 minutes?
Another 20 minutes, but can we turn the lights back on?
Yeah, we need the lights on.
Hit the lights.
I'm not going to use that.
They take a second to turn on. Do them. Yeah. And then the other one?
So, some very dense papers and graphs still. The video will be available on Marxist-Humanist Initiative's website after the conference. So if you want to refresh, all the graphs will be provided, and evidently a couple other places. Also for the Q&A session, if you don't want to be filmed, that's going to prevent you from asking a question, just sort of indicate somehow that you don't want the cameras on you.
Those lights are still down. That's
So
all.
it may take time to fire up. So our next presenter is going to be Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson is the author of Super Imperialism, The Bubble and Beyond, and many other books on international finance and economic history, which say Super Imperialism is one book, and The Bubble and Beyond is another. So, take it away.
Alan said that he had thought the first title for this conference should be Why the Left Gets It Wrong. And if this were like the other left forum conferences, I'd say, no, Alan, that's not why the left gets it wrong. This is why the left gets it wrong. And because I am going to talk about different things from what you just heard, but I'm in full agreement with what's said. I'm just going to talk about a different perspective. The productivity is really what Marx's theories of surplus value was all about. It was concepts of productivity. And when I was taking my PhD at NYU, I wanted to write my dissertation on concepts of productivity. That was suggested to me by the first translator of theories of surplus value, Terence McCarthy. So at that time, the professor at NYU was Solomon Fabricant. Perfect name, for reasons I'll tell you. He was head of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Made an appointment with him. He came in, he said, I liked your paper. Will you join the CIA? He'd asked in class, tried to recruit, he said, I'm a recruiter for the CIA. I would like you to work. And I said, what do I say? I don't think I can pass the first personality interview. But then I said, well, I want to write my dissertation on the topic that you're teaching, productivity. He said, why on earth would you want to write on the history of concepts of productivity? Economics has risen to, his words were, its current point of perfection by rejecting ideas that are old. There would absolutely no point at all in writing the concept of productivity. We've done it all here at the National Bureau. And he showed me what at that time was most in discussion, productivity. The National Bureau had productivity in the United States. I'm blocking out the name of the author. It was, this is what we were all taught at that time. But the concepts are so bizarre I can tell you right now that at that time, this was in the early 1960s, when President Kennedy had just passed the wage productivity guidelines in the steel industry. The guidelines said that the employees in the steel industry should be paid according to their productivity gains. I thought immediately exactly the point that was just pointed out. Yeah, I'm just that Andrew just pointed out that that would have meant essentially capital is free. If you have to pay the employee, all the concept of the increase in productivity and the productivity is a result of capital productivity, not labor productivity. If you build a new machine that uses energy more efficiently and the machine is more efficient, that's capital productivity, not labor productivity. I thought that the capitalist class would love this idea as an excuse not to pay labor so much, but it didn't phase Fabricant. He said, no, what we're doing is perfect. He said, no, I'm turning down the thesis, but I'm not going to let you write on that, but will you join the CIA? So, well, their loss is... But one of the reasons that I wanted to write on this topic is this concept of wage and productivity. Do you know how productivity is defined in the service sector? The service sector, your productivity is defined by how do you measure services? How do you measure the services that Goldman Sachs and these other people, doctors, other people produce, Marx added prostitutes, and other people, if they're working for an employer, in which case they're productive labor. The productivity is defined by how much you earn. So if your salary and you pay yourself twice as much in the service industry, the Bureau of Labor Statistics counts your productivity as doubling. There's no other way to measure productivity. You can't do output of steel beams per hour. You can't do construction or brick making. The only way of measuring productivity in the services is by how much you produce. So, and all of this goes back to 100 years ago, John Bates Clark, for whom they created the John Bates Clark Medal that's usually given by the University of Chicago to supporters of the Pinochet regime and its successors. And Clark said that he proved mathematically that every worker is paid according to his productivity. That assumption underlies all of the mathematics that underlines the statistics and their forecasts. So basically, garbage in, garbage out is what you get. So when people talk about productivity, that concept itself has to be thrown into question. Now, when I've known Alan for a number of years. When he was working in London, there was some thought of hiring an advisor on real estate, which is my main, at that time was my main field. It turned out they hired somebody promoted by so Alan tells me, by the real estate industry, not a critic. And I didn't meet Andrew until a few months ago when he gave a lecture at Bertel Ullman's seminar at New York University. I think he's done a wonderful job of going over the NIPA, and I can assure you, going over these national income and product accounts is very time-taking, it's very tedious. I don't know anyone else on the left that's doing this, or on the right, or in universities. In none of my university education was the national income statistics or any government statistics actually discussed. I tried to put a program together for one of the universities here, and they just said, well, nobody's hiring them. Usually, the only way that you can learn how to even deal with these statistics is working in the field. I learned at Chase Manhattan on Wall Street how to deal with them, and at other banks. If I hadn't been employed, I certainly wouldn't have learned anything in the education. But I was very surprised that his statistics were so different from mine. And I asked about depreciation. His answer was, he's dealing with the corporate sector. Well, that's natural, because if you're a Marxist, that's what you're dealing with, corporate industry and that. I've dealt primarily with the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. And in the national income and product accounts, if you're looking for how business operates, there are two different sets of accounts. One is corporate business, the other is partnerships and households. Most real estate is held in the form of the partnerships, most finance. The fire sector operates, it doesn't treat itself as a corporate sector for various tax advantages. And the picture there is very different. For instance, I asked Andrew, where is depreciation in all of this? And he pointed out that it wasn't all that large. And I was very surprised. And then that's when he told me that he wasn't dealing with the partnerships. If you look at the real estate sector, the real estate sector hasn't made, this is the biggest sector of the economy. 80% of bank loans are to real estate. Real estate is the largest asset in the economy, not machinery and factories and plant and equipment. The real estate sector has not made any profit since World War II. It's as you know, it's charitable industry, as is the oil and gas industry, the mining industry, and the natural resources industry, which of course we know what happens. There's depletion. The assumption underlying, if you own a building like you're Donald Trump or Harry Helmsley, and you own a building, you're allowed to pretend that the building loses value every year because it's wearing out. Now, you know, living in New York, that if a landlord doesn't spend 10% of the rent roll on maintenance and repairs, you can throw him in jail. But the pretense is that the landlord doesn't make any repairs, nothing's happening, the building's falling apart. And under the Reagan administration, you could write off the value of an entire building in accelerated double declining balance of depreciation, which means in 7.5 years your building is worthless. And because you've just lost all of the capital you've just invested in the building, you can take that off your income tax against profits. So you may, not only do you not make a profit, if you look at the national income and product account under taxes and earnings by the real estate industry, which they merged at that time with finance. You can't really segregate finance and real estate. They're so interconnected. You find that they actually made a loss against which they could offset any income they happen to earn in genuine profit-making ventures. So as Harry Helmsley's wife, Leona, said, only the little people pay taxes, meaning only the little people make a profit. Rich people don't want to make a profit. If you make a profit, you pay an income tax. When I was at Chase, my first really big job was making a balance of payments of the oil industry. And the treasurer of Standard Oil, before it was called Exxon, took me to his office, and I said, I read everything I could about the oil industry. Do they make their profits at the production end, where they drill the oil in the third world, Middle East, or do they make it at the refining end when they sell it to you? And he said, we make the profits right here in my office. And I said, I decided, you know, where we make them. And I said, well, where can I find these? I've looked all over. I can't find any profits anywhere. He said, did you think of looking at the international balance of payment statistics under the international at the end? You have Europe, Asia, Latin America, and then you have something called international. I said, yes. I thought everything's international. What does that mean, international? He said, many people ask that question. It means flag of convenience. It means Liberia and Panama and countries that aren't real nations. They use the American dollar. They don't have an income tax. And he said, we sell all the oil we get out of the Middle East at such a low price that we don't have to pay any taxes at all. Very little to the sheiks in Saudi Arabia. We sell it at a low price to the shipping companies in Liberia, and then the shipping company sells it at a high price to the refiners, so high a price that the refineries don't make any profit in Europe or America, so that there's no profit anywhere but here in these little enclaves that we've carved out, where there isn't any income tax. So of course, all our profits offshore, we don't make any profit at all. So not only is productivity a problem, but as Alan said, there are many concepts of profit to make. The concept that I always use as the basis which is going to give you the key for what Marx called the organic composition of capital, is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, EBITDA. This is what all the cash flow people calculate. This is what George Romney calculates when he's going to take over a company. How much can we charge off as expenses? Depreciation, management fee, interest. If you want to set up your own business and not make an income, you put some of your money offshore in the Cayman Islands. You lend, this is what they do in Iceland. Alcoa wanted to build some aluminum refineries in Iceland. Aluminum is basically made out of electricity because bauxite is everywhere. It's just perfect. So they said, we're going to create jobs for Iceland. They created 200 jobs to make about $20 billion off these 200 jobs. And they don't make any profit at all because Alcoa creates an offshore financing affiliate that lends enough money to the Icelandic affiliate so that all the profit it makes is absorbed in interest paid to the offshore affiliate in the Cayman Islands for loans to the Icelandic industry. Obviously, there's a very big payoff there, and Iceland is a small country where everybody's related to everybody else, and even the prime ministers that I've spoken to did acknowledge that the problem is that their family members were many of the crooks that ran the banks, and it's very hard to prosecute your own family members, so what can you do? That's Icelandic socialism, so to spread the payoff money all the way. So there are many different kinds of socialism as well, profits, you see. So the problem is that getting into these statistics is just a statistical maze. I didn't think there was much point in coming out with my own dueling charts and dueling statistics. The theoretical background of all of this argument about productivity is in an article I wrote about Simon Patton, who was the first business school professor in America in the 1880s at the Wharton School of Economics. That's on my website. I've discussed a lot of the analysis and the bubble and beyond and finance capitalism in a distant tense, where I get into some of these. But the problem is that when Marx wrote his theories of surplus value, you didn't have an income tax, and so you didn't have cost accountants. You didn't have a whole profession of accountants and lawyers trying to figure out how do I not pay any tax at all by representing the economic data scientifically, because it's empirical, as if we don't make any profit at all. And since the income tax was introduced in America in 1913, and in other countries, all of a sudden you have a misrepresentation of statistics that is basically, the purpose of statistics is to prove that workers get everything they deserve, if not produce, and that everything works in somehow equilibrium. And by the way, the bubble we just had couldn't really have existed scientifically because they proved it mathematically. So it's, we're in somewhat of a mess. For me, the key, all of the EBITDA, the cash flow in real estate in this country is absorbed by interest and depreciation. And Marx wrote a lot about depreciation. And he saw it very largely as obsolescence. He'd say, look, the problem is, and this is the idea that Schumpeter demarxified in calling it creative disruption. Marx said a perfect machine will last for a long time, but there will be a more efficient machine. And so the old machinery, the old means of production has to be scrapped. And in fact, the very first Carnegie's first oil steel mill, he built it all up, he scrapped the whole thing before it even began because there was a new technology that came in. So the pretense in real estate is that a building is just like a steel mill. It obsolesces and wears out. So that means that the pre-war buildings in New York should not be selling at a premium over the most recent luxury, meaning plastified buildings. You have an inside-out world of statistics, making it very hard just to prove things by statistics. So you've had one example from Andrew on the the wage productivity idea, but that's just one of many. And these are the things that not only the left, but the right should be talking about as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to give Will some time to switch out the battery, and everybody can think about questions. We have plenty of time for questions for all the panelists. I'm going to send around the mailing list for Marxist-Humanist Initiative if you'd like to sign up. We don't spam. If anybody wants to sit.
Yeah.
So we'll take 3 questions at a time. 3 questions, each question or comment. Just let me know. You ready? Okay. So we have 1, 2, 3. Go in that order.
You know, I read a lot about executive compensation being. I read
Speak
a lot
louder.
about executive compensation being like, you know, in 1960 something, being about 40 times the average worker's pay, and now it's something like 400 times. Is that incorrect?
Next.
Referring to Piketty's data and the talks that you gentlemen have just given, Andrew says in the description in the little handout we got, inequality is the thing I'd like to stress, was not a main cause of the Great Recession because the distribution of income or whatever hadn't deteriorated as far as workers are concerned.
Could you say that again a bit louder?
Inequality, I've always thought, is a major factor underlying the crash of 2008, for the simple reason that workers didn't have enough money to spend to buy the products, as Henry Ford said they should have. And on the other side of the equation, the high-income families were earning so much, or receiving so much, that they really couldn't spend the money reasonably, and therefore contributed to what you might call the demand side of bubbles. So I wonder, in light of your data, Andrew, and your comments, Michael, what remains of Piketty? What's your estimate of how valid Piketty's views are, including the increase of inequality through the period since 1970 and in the 2000s, and how that would affect the debate?
Gentleman in white.
I mean, that's pretty close to what I wanted to ask, actually, about what's left of Piketty, but I also wanted to ask, I mean, Sam Gibbons himself, actually, I think, sparring with Andrew, so I was wondering what your response to that was. That seems to me like there's a case for voluntary rate of profit. That's you guys, Robert Brenner, and some others, but there are a few people who identify as ostensibly on the left, who've been trying to argue that capitalism is just fine. So.
Okay, we're going to close the round and then have responses, and then we'll get some more questions.
I think that most of it for me. On executive compensation, and actually on all income data, and I'm not a real expert on wealth data, probably on wealth data as well, you've got to be extremely careful about exactly who is being measured, how they're being measured. It's not that all of these things are kind of the same and give you basically the same result. You know, different definitions of income give you widely different results. You know, when you say managers or executives, exactly who you're counting, you get widely different results. So, you know, I've seen figures like from 40 times the average pay, which also you have to ask, you know, the average pay of whom, up to 400. I've seen a little bit higher. I've seen 40 to 200. that's risen. Now, the question is how deeply that rise goes down the ladder of executives. I mean, clearly, if you're talking about Fortune 500 companies, S&P 500 companies, Standard & Poor's 1,500 companies, you know, the largest publicly traded, that it means they're on stock exchanges, companies, you know, the top 5 or so executives, that's generally who gets counted in these statistics. They have done really, really, really well. Okay, that's such a small segment of people, though, it doesn't have a big effect when you get to the aggregate statistics. And that's how I'm able to get statistics that don't show much of a change, even though, you know, the few people at the top are doing very, very well. There's only a few of them. You know, how many top 100 CEOs are there? It's a Grant's Tomb kind of question, right? That's I think that issue, and I think that that study that I showed from Bakia Kolheim is really the first major attempt. They did incredible work to try to go deeper, deeper down into the layers of management and see, you know, who's getting what. We just don't have very much information about that. I mean, you know, there's a lot of government statistics, but you don't get statistics on, you know, like middle management or even upper level management. Like, we don't know anything about the 10th highest paid, you know, executive in any kind of corporation at all. And once you get away from the publicly traded corporations, it's really hard to know anything at all. So, okay. Let me say this thing about Henry Ford, because it drives me crazy all the time. You know, whatever he may have said, if indeed he said it, it was a joke. Okay? It was like, you know, he paid his workers $5 a day more than they were getting elsewhere because he would increase his profits because they would buy more cars. Okay, now, think about this for just a second. Any capitalist who pays workers more than he needs to pay the workers is, in the best case, going to keep his profit just the same. That assumes that the extra money that he spends, okay, they all spend on his cars, and it doesn't cost him anything to produce those additional cars. If it costs him anything to produce those additional cars, he's losing money by paying them more than he needs to. And if they spend, you know, $1 that's not on Fords, if they spend $1, you know, on rent, okay, he's going to be losing money that way. So this whole notion of Fordism is first of all wrong. I think in general, under consumptionist reasoning is just wrong. And beyond that, well, in my book, the white book, if it's over there, yeah. Failure of Capitalist Production, Chapter 8 goes into under consumptionism, why it doesn't really make sense theoretically, but also empirically. The employee compensation share, as I showed, did not fall from 1970 to the Great Recession. Earlier, it rose. You know, you take away the top salaried executives, it doesn't seem to do anything. Also, if you add in like social benefits, the working class share rose a little bit. So it's not that workers did not have enough to spend. In fact, their income allowed them to buy a slightly larger share of the product over time. Now, there might be an issue with lower paid workers versus higher paid workers. But the data are not really there that would, I mean, enable me to say, and there is a debate about the share of income that gets spent among different income groups. You know, so people say, well, the people lower down spend a bigger share of their income. I just don't see any. First of all, you know, excessive spending of income relative to income. Like, I don't think that was a source of a debt buildup. despite the savings rate going down, that's ignoring increases in net worth and stuff. The broader point on Piketty's data, I mean, I certainly haven't, by what I did today, impugned his data. I think there are real problems with the tax return data that he uses and that Emmanuel Saez uses. That's not their fault. Those are limitations of tax return data. I mean, you want to mistrust government statistics. Okay, really the tax return data are really kind of dicey. Self-reported things, and you got really, when you want to talk about the accountants and so forth doing a job, they do much more of a job on those statistics than anything. I think it's actually a very good data set that they managed to compile, and it can tell us a lot, but I think that Piketty and those people have overextended the use of that, the IRS data that they rely on. They're making comparisons that I think go far beyond what the data really allow. The biggest problem is that income as measured in the tax returns is tax income, and it misses a whole lot of income. So it gives us a very misleading, picture of income and the distribution of income in the country, because especially for people lower down, it misses a lot of components of their income.
I agree with what Andrew has said. I'll give you some examples of the problems with Piketty. He has done an enormous amount of work on the tax data, but there's a problem with the tax data. And again, let's look at the largest category, capital gains. In the real estate industry, when you sell a building at a huge capital gain, you don't have to pay any capital gain to declare it if you recycle what you get into buying yet a new building. And upon death, all capital gains taxes and statistics are wiped out when they're given to your heirs. So if you look at the increase in property asset prices, they're going way up. And if you look at Piketty's tax-based data, they're not going up, because the difference between real increase in the assets held by the other 1% and anybody, and the actual capital gains that you declare, there's a vast difference. There are a number of problems. For instance, also, the 2008 crisis was not caused by underconsumption. It was caused by a break in the chain of payments because people stopped buying crooked junk mortgages. They were called liars' loans. The liars were the banks, not the people that took them out. The newspapers somehow missed that point. They get, just who's doing the lying? It's the bank's mortgage broker who fills out the figures, and the crooked appraisers they hire, and the crooked bank managers that package them together, and the crooked rating agencies that give them AAA, saying there's a little chance to default on this as there is buying a treasury bond. So we know who the crooks are. Finally, even the German Landesbanks and the American pension funds caught on to the deal, and they stopped buying. The real underconsumption problem is what's happened after 2008. Now there's austerity. Now they're making people pay, and now they're making people, the savings rate has gone way up. And what is the saving? The savings rate was zero because the 1% was doing about 18% of national income and saving, was lending all its savings out to the 99% for debt so that they could make interest on them. But then the banks stopped lending after 2008, and all of a sudden people had to be repaying their mortgage, repaying their credit card debt, and that was called saving. It's not what you think of as savings in the bank. It's not the kind of saving that's available for spending. It's a saving that is, as Hegel said, a negation of a negation. You're negating the debt that you had, you're paying it down, and that's counted as a positive, as those of you who know grade school algebra, it turns out all positive, and that's the kind of rise in saving that Wall Street celebrates, as if people are now becoming much more aware of the things they did before. So the problem not only is that people are, you have debt deflation now that's creating the problem, and that's, Marx didn't talk about debt deflation. He didn't talk about the increase in the amount of debt relative to output, because at that time, there weren't leveraged buyouts going on. And Marx, the whole problem in Marx's day with finance is throughout history, from Sumerian times, antiquity, Middle Ages, down to Marx's day. People didn't make money. Banks didn't lend money to build factories. They lent money against goods that are already produced. They lent money in shipping, or they'd make usury. They wouldn't lend money to buy property or to build a factory or anything else. So there was no such thing. And Marx believed that somehow industrial capitalism was going to shape the economy so that you would industrialize finance and you would make it rational so that it would become productive lending and the most superior technology and mode of production would win out. It hasn't worked out that way. Obviously, you cannot say that today's world is the world that Marx anticipated, because he didn't anticipate that the rentiers would fight back. He said, well, the one thing the 1848 revolutions did was, you know, they, at least now you have the bourgeoisie, the middle class, fighting against the landed aristocracy. You know, you're having the landlordism and usury, a thing of the past. Now we're all moving into an industrial capitalist economy. But they all fought, the rentiers fought back, and we have the society we have now, so that out of the worker's paycheck, the problem is not that the workers are paid so little of what they produce. It's that 40%, up to 42%, according to the Federal Housing Authority here, of their income can go to pay for housing. 7.5% is FICA, wage withholding of the paycheck. About 10% is other debt service. And 10% is other taxes. So the workers are only able to spend about 1/3 of what they get on the goods and services they produce. That's what they mean by post-industrial economy.
I think there's two things that we've got to think what we're trying to do here. One is, I don't think the function of this panel, it's not intended that we're going to supply the answers to your questions. The function of this panel is to assist you to know where to go and look in order to make your own minds up about the answers to the questions. And the main thing that we've certainly been working on is to say the first place you have to go and look is the places that everybody's been telling you you shouldn't look. Why are they telling you you shouldn't look there? There is a reason. Why are the Marxists saying you should not use Marx? You have to think about that. Why are the Marxists the main people in the world? The academic world of America is different in other parts of the world, and it's different in non-academic circles. The people who are saying that you should not read Marx. The answer is in Andrew's article in the Weak Interpretation of History. The thing that I urge you to read, but the fundamental reason is that academics have material interests of their own. They have to preserve their own careers. They have to preserve their own position as intermediaries between the world of knowledge and the world of ordinary, of working people. Right? So that's a very important thing to bear in mind. So that what we're trying to do is to say that something that had been delegitimated, Marxist theory, is legitimate. And you'll have noticed, and you'll see if you go back over the video, Andrew would periodically say, why am I saying this? Because this shows that we cannot rule out Marxist theory. Because the ways that this is done is, first of all, there was this huge wave of stuff in the 70s and 60s to say Marx was inconsistent. This is still continuing with Michael Heinrichs. Marx doesn't really have a theory. Yes, he does have a theory. It may be wrong, it may be right, but you have to try it. Now, the second way it's done is we have an alternative, and the alternative is so perfect you don't need Marx, like your guy, you know. We've reached perfection. We don't need that stuff. The problem I have with the inequality literature is that it is posed as we have the answer. Therefore, it's posed as yet another reason you don't need to go back and look at Marx's explanation, which is the falling rate of profit. We need to look at both explanations, and what we're now discussing is not the legitimacy of the theories, but the validity. So I'm going to throw in a couple of things about validity. First of all, it is incredibly easy to show that inequality has increased. Practically any change in the fortune of any individual brings about an increase in inequality. Because that individual will either get richer than somebody else they were previously equal to, or they'll get poorer than somebody, and that will change the averages. So inequality is just with us like the poor. It's just always there, like death and taxes. The issue is whether it's a cause. That's a real issue. And the issue is also what is needed to get out of the crisis. Now, I think that the rate of profit provides the best explanation of the crisis. All the work that we've been doing on the evidence. There's this theory, there's that theory, there's that possible cause, that possible. Why? Because it explains a long-run trend which operates despite all the other things, inequality, equality, finance, whatever. That trend has been in operation pretty well since 1946 in the US rate of profit, and there's now a volume of work being done by some very good Argentinian economists, Esteban Michael and other people, which suggests that that's a common trend across much of the world over a very long historical period. Some very exciting new work coming out. Why does that offer an explanation? It's because demand is not just consumer demand. If you look at what is spent on the product of the capitalists, actually 70% of it, 60% is consuming. The rest is either the replacement of raw materials or investment in new machinery. A crisis of capitalism, as opposed to a crisis of any other activity, occurs when capital stops doing that. That's what a crisis is, when it just puts its money away in monetary assets or in real estate or in speculation or in something that does not mean it does not employ workers to make more value. That's what a crisis is. If you read Marx's account and his demolition of Say's law, he says, you know, what neoclassicals don't understand is the circuit of capital can simply stop. People can just hold on to the money and do nothing with it. Okay? That explanation fits all the facts that we see about the current recession. The explanation based on lack of consumption does not fit all the facts, because there has been nothing like a sufficient reduction in consumption to explain the severity of the crisis. That's why I prefer that causal explanation. A different issue is how to get out, because I think that the fundamental facts of the present situation is capitalist private investment in further production is not coming back. I don't think they are going to get us out of the crisis. That's why socialized measures of some kind or another are going to be necessary. We can have a big discussion. I mean, I am much more of the sort of let the government do its school. Other people will say, no, the government's not going to do it, that's crazy, that's just going to divert people into reformist programs. We need a much more thoroughgoing reorganization of society. Fine, that's a tactical discussion for me. The fundamental issue is private capital ain't going to do it. When we do it, we will have to overcome inequality. I cannot possibly see any way to restore, you know, growth, particularly growth of human capacity, because that's what growth really consists of. Not the increasing use of resources, but the increasing use of humans. Brains as well as bodies, hence increasing creativity, aesthetic employment. Every aspect of being human is what you actually have to grow. You cannot do that while, and it's a world question, you know, 80% of the world is living on $4 a day or under. And when people talk about inequality, the last thing I'm going to say is this. I did a lot of work on international inequality. There's a paper I wrote just called The Poverty of Statistics. The inequality you find in any single country, particularly America, pales into insignificance compared with inequality on a world scale. I calculated a simple indicator. It's the average income of the whole of the third world divided by the average income of the developed so-called, we now call it the no longer developing world. Okay? The 80% versus the 20%, which is, people don't talk about in the occupied movement. And let's turn it the other way around. The rich divided by the poor. Between 1980 and 2000, that was the period of neoliberalism. It started off at 8 to 1. The average worker in America was 8 times better off than the average worker in the Philippines, 40 times better off than the average worker in India. Right? Sorry, 20 times better than. Over 20 years, that trebled. So at the end of the neoliberal period, that was 24 to 1 instead of 8 to 1. It then began to reverse. around about 2003, with the growth of China, and with China's impact on the rest of the developing world, that began to turn around. I think that was actually part of the causal mechanism, a part of it, but you won't get the world out of the crisis without making that one-to-one. That's what you've actually got to do. It's a huge transformation of world human capacity will be necessary. I don't think capitalism's up to it. I don't think capitalism can do that. The very fact that the greatest economy in the world, the American economy, is thrown into crisis, in part because other countries are catching up. It's got to tell you something about what the stability of that economy and the political system is based on. So I would say, yeah, inequality reversing, particularly international inequality, is going to be very important for getting out. But I don't see it as the reason we got into the mess in the first place.
Okay.
Can I add something to what he said? I agree. This is really very important, that the crisis of capitalism is that its failure to be what industrial capitalism was supposed to be, employing workers to produce output at a profit. The crisis of capitalism is its falling back into feudalism, out of which it emerged, back into a rentier society, back into the landlords and the financial sector. That's what really the crisis of capitalism is. And what made Marx revolutionary was he invented, in the process of the series of surplus value, he invented cost accounting. It was his critique of Kliman and the circular flow of the tableau économique, where he pointed out Kliman left out something. He left, in all the, what the farmer spends his money on and the circular flow between farmers and the government workers, he left out part of the return to the farmer has to be the seed corn that he keeps over to plant for next year's crop. And he said the analogy of that is the capitalist needs to not only to replace his machinery, but to keep up with all of the new technology of machinery, and his falling rate of profit meant the increasing degree of capital intensity, and that was what all of his mathematics were about. So in fighting it, what makes Marx so hated by the ruling class is that he did accounting. He outlined an accounting framework. How do you argue with an accounting framework? How do you say that you can't argue with double counting bookkeeping? I mean, and Marx did the accounting framework. That was what made him so much of a threat to the status quo, because he showed how capitalism itself was revolutionary.
Okay, we have enough. We have about 23 more minutes. We go 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you could keep your questions brief and the responses brief, we'll have one.
Excuse me, did the mailing list go down this side? All right, I'll leave another one here, and please, before you run out to lunch, do take a look at our books and pamphlets, and Michael's book, and see if you want to get any.
Can I say in particular, it's important to sign up for the mailing list because Marxist-Humanist Initiative will be putting the video on its website, and you can get a notification of that. We don't have any assurance, and I have my doubts as to whether the Left Forum will want to feature this panel and publish it. So it might just appear on the Marxist-Humanist Initiative site.
Open University of the Left will also put this up. It'll probably be on next Tuesday, next meeting. Either or you can get there.
I'm sort of puzzled or confused by the discussion. On the one hand, the panel is suggesting that there is a declining rate of profit and therefore we have a crisis. And but on the other hand, in the same breath, the panel is suggesting that most of the profit is either in depreciation or overseas and all those. But we know, according to what we see observed by whatever imperfect system we have, rate of profit is not falling. They are saying they are falling, but yet here they are. There is a little hold out somewhere that most of profit is there. So which one is it? Which is true?
That you have to work out yourself.
My
We can't
question
tell
is
you.
really similar. I noticed the same thing, and I think Michael just
gave an answer to it that I'll let you answer. You did, in the description, you said you were going to talk about quantitative easing, and is that, what's the connection between the growth of the fire sector versus the falling, they're talking about falling rate of profit in industrial sector. And you've already answered these questions, but that's my question.
Who's next? So my question follows on these as well. I mean, you've all made very good cases for, in a way, the lack of Marxist accounting. And Andrew's references to the Henwood quote and Piketty and the BLS stats, underlines that, we should all distrust a lot of the way that productivity and other kinds of stats like this are used. But I guess it just, to me, begs the question a little bit. I mean, if we're all in a bit of an ocean of difficulty with, the way that standard statistics are measured, why has this not been more of an exercise within the Marxist, Marxist critics and analysts? And Michael mentions at the end of his talk about, or no, just in response to a question, that the way that Marx himself actually pioneered a certain kind of accounting, but then you added in your presentation that that was before leverage buyouts and the what's emerged in finance, which you argue we can't even really trace because of the way that really surplus values get hidden and disguised. So really that's my question, is really, isn't this then a major project that hasn't been sufficiently pursued?
I had a question similar to what the first two raised, in that there's analysis that says the rate of profit has fallen, and that's based on profit in production, and then there's also analysis that there's this huge mass of property income and wealth. And for any of the panelists, I'd like to know what you think about the role of capital gains in that, and how much of that is simply fictitious capital, which now dominates some kind of flow from general surplus value, and how it actually accomplishes that. I also had a more specific question for Andrew, which is that you show this divergence between productivity and the wage share for the U.S., and you identify statistical problems for the U.S., but as far as I'm aware, the same divergence is shown in all the other developed countries. Do they have the same statistical problems? And if the statistical problems are the same, what is the reason that you have a common statistical problem to so many indices?
Okay, we'll take one more quickly.
Okay, yeah, just generally. It seems to me you've demonstrated that, first of all, I want to ask, do you think socially, not individually, there's been a rise, there's been an increase in inequality of wealth and income? Secondly, then you seem to demonstrate that if there has been, it's not because capital is taking a larger share of productive profits, then what is what has caused, what do you think? Where should we look to explain, if you think there has been a rise in social inequality of income and wealth, where would you look to explain that if it doesn't come from capital grabbing more than others?
Can you, because I can't see, can you just type in Marxism 21, falling profitability, U.S. multinationals? Google? Yeah, in Google.
Falling profitability?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Can you bring that up? Okay, so you can find this paper online, published in a Korean English journal. It takes time to load because the dicey website. Okay, but I did a paper that looked at profit and the rate of profit of U.S. multinationals abroad. And the thing is that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the people give us the GDP figures and all of this, they maintain two sets of accounts. one for domestic corporate activity, one for international. And the basic things when I say this is what's happening to compensation and then the rate of profit, that's purely for the domestic sector. There's been a huge growth of multinational activity abroad. Investment abroad, receipt of profit from abroad. Okay, so the profits have grown tremendously that are held abroad, or that are received from abroad. The thing is, though, that the U.S. investment, U.S. direct foreign investment abroad, foreign direct investment abroad, has grown even faster. So the rate of profit, the income from foreign direct investment, as a percentage of the foreign direct investment, that rate of profit has actually fallen. And that's what this paper shows for pretty much country after country where U.S. Investment is located, with the exception of tax havens. Okay, but on average and stuff, it falls. I can't really see from here what it is, but at some point I got like 20 different countries here. Whatever. If I can go back to the top, can you get me back to the top just so people can see the title? Okay, so that's as far as I can see what's going on. Now, Michael is raising really important issues regarding whether this stuff gets taxed anywhere. But there's a different issue as to whether it gets recorded, you know, as income anywhere. And I suspect that it does. So I suspect that nothing is being left out of what gets counted as profit, just what's being just not taxed. I thought that second question, Marxist accounting, why is this not more of an issue? It all goes to exactly what Alan Freeman has been talking about the whole time. Getting at the truth and the lack of desire to get at the truth. Okay? People will tell a story that goes over nice and smoothly with the audience. And as long as there's no pushback, they'll just keep telling that story and they'll get lazy. Okay? And they'll try to keep dissident opinions from being heard and challenging that. And so you don't get like a debate so that you really need to say, let's turn to the evidence and get this exactly right. Only that pushback, only the demand for truth from below, okay, from the public is going to get the standards of scholarship to rise. Okay? There's nothing that's going to, you know, it's not like, you know, like sometimes people say the free market works, competition works. Okay, well, there's no competition among the left, okay? There's basically monopoly. Okay, the monopoly capital school has monopoly. Okay, and because of that, you know, this is what we get. We get people who are able to sell their stuff, you know, and don't get challenged. Yeah, capital gains. Capital gains are not surplus value from production. What a capital gain is basically people are drawing on existing wealth, or new borrowing just takes place, and people say, well, okay, you know, I'm going to buy this share of this, or I'm going to buy a tulip, and, you know, hope the price rises. And if it rises, you know, then they make more money, but it's not coming from somewhere. Okay, it's just that other people are willing to pay more for that share or tulip or whatever. Inequality of wealth and income. So a good deal of it's capital gains. Okay. Apart from that, there's been a real increase in inequality of labor income. Professionals have done very well across a variety of professions, including like health technicians and so forth. People in finance have done very well. More highly educated workers have done well. Workers with less formal education have done poorly. Another thing to understand, and I think that goes more to the issue of profit, is that a good deal of the inequality of income reflects the following. Not more profit, but a bigger share of the profit getting distributed to people rather than held by the corporations themselves. So you got a given pool of profit, let's say, but if the corporations retain less and pay more dividends to shareholders and pay out more interest, okay, that will be reflected as a rise in inequality among personal income. So I think that explains a good deal of it.
I think Andrew is right. Despite the fact that the statistics have been distorted, you can take them apart and re-put them together to make a profit. And what he's talking about, essentially, he just mentioned the difference between productive capitalist profit, M, C, M prime, just to become financialized, M to M prime. That's making money from money instead of making money without interacting with the production process at all. Now, Marx thought that, of course, that couldn't work for any length of time, and it doesn't work. And I am guilty of the false advertising by not mentioning the quantitative easing. So I do want to say something, because the reason I included it to begin with, I was going to focus on austerity in the fire sector. The purpose of quantitative easing is simply to create a new bubble, to prevent the decline. It's not to help people buy more goods and services. It's not to help employment. It's to make housing as expensive as it was before, to prevent labor from buying what it produces. It's to increase the asset prices, to increase the 1%, to enable them to crush the 99%. That's their game. That's what their economy is. So quantitative easing is to give, to lower the interest rate so much. One effect is the pension funds are going broke. They're not going to make the 8.5% they want. That's going to be used as, we will solve the crisis, let the pension funds turn their money over to Wall Street, privatize Social Security, give it all to Goldman Sachs. You know what's going to happen with that. So there's a whole game plan. All we need is a crisis for them to push it in. And no time to think. High-pressure salesmanship always works. Don't think, just here's the plan. We have one. Does anyone else have one? Oh, okay, here it is. So probably the next Democratic administration will do what no Republican administration could succeed, and privatize Social Security. And result of this, the whole purpose is the economy's become a ripoff. We're back into neo-feudalism. This is not industrial capitalism. And Marx's accounting and set of categories distinguished industrial capitalism from feudalism. That's the one thing nobody wants you to know, because that's where we're going.
I think one of the reasons that brother over there we may have confused you is you may be under the illusion that we're saying the same thing. We're not. We didn't set out to say the same thing. We're saying different things. So you have to put that together yourself. I mean, there are many issues I'd like to discuss with Michael, not least the fact that I know the national accountants. The national accountants know what is done with the research, and they make a very considerable effort to put it back in. They know these things go on. Nobody knows. I mean, there's a famous letter of Marx to Engels about absolute rent, where he says, I have discovered that in all cases where there is a dispute between the statistician and the economist, the statisticians are right in 99% of cases. Right? Another interesting thing, economists do not have a code of ethics. Statisticians do. Very interesting fact I found out from Jordan DiMartino, right? And the United Nations is actually one of the pioneering things it's doing, is working on exactly what constitutes. So go to the statistics and you'll find that there are corrections that are being done. But I just want to finish on one last thing, this issue of inequality. Remember the last slide I put up of Facebook gang warfare? So one of the tactics is to try and line people up. That you can't agree with or contemplate what this person is saying because they're that kind of a person. Now one corner that is easy to get painted into is inequality deniers. This is what, you know, because you say that the rate of profit is the most important causal factor, you are denying inequality. No, nobody's denying inequality. Nobody is denying that it's a very, very important thing to reduce it, not least as anybody who's been in a position of being a trade union leader knows. You cannot get working class solidarity whilst the guys at the top are earning 6 times as much as the sisters at the bottom, which is the way it always works out. You cannot do it, which is why, you know, progressive trade unionism always seeks to increase wages at the bottom more than at the top and close that gap. And the employers always resist that. They always try to get the gap increased because they know that will set you fighting each other instead of fighting them. There's no issue of denial. The issue is, first of all, it is an extremely complicated and difficult thing to measure and even to say what it is. Like, as I was saying, anybody's income changes in any direction, it's going to increase inequality. What do you really mean by it? I think that the key thing in being confused in the discussion is inequality is getting mixed up with working class share. This is the key point that Andrew made. That the share of income of the working class of America in the output of America, measured in monetary terms, which is the only, the way the statisticians actually measure it when they're doing their job right, has not gone down. It may have done at certain points in history, 65 it's done. There are countries like Greece. I mean, let me tell you, if the capitalist class in America starts to work the way that the capitalist class in Europe is doing, you'll see what a defeat is. I mean, I often say this to American audiences. You think the working class in this country has been through a defeat. You haven't seen anything yet in terms of what these guys are going to do. Why are they going to do it? Because they're in a mess that they can't dig themselves out of by pushing your wages down. They have a mess of their own making. That's why it's actually important to realize that the rate of profit and the internal contradictions within the capitalist mode of production, nothing to do with what the workers are doing, are creating situations which the workers then will have to respond to. And at a very high political level, much higher level than just saying, let's get more wages. You're going to have to take over all the things that capitalism is failing to do. You're going to have to sort out the problem of ecology, and gender inequality, of disabilities, of access to art, every single problem of society we're going to have to sort out, because they can't, right? But to understand that you have to do that, you first have to understand what a big mess they're in. And the fact that the mess is not half full, and it can't be solved by taking it out on the working class. And that's the real issue. It's sort of, it's on the one hand, what are you measuring? You're measuring class difference. You're not measuring any, inequality in general, which of course is increased in certain sections, right? And the second is that its cause, what's causing this crisis, is the inequality the cause of it. I don't think it is. And thirdly, there's a difference between what you do to get out of a crisis and how you get into it. You don't just reverse. And I do actually think that in order to create a new society that's capable of overcoming the problems that capitalism introduced, of course it's going to be necessary to reverse inequality. It's a fundamental demand of any movement that calls itself socialist to do that. So not inequality deniers, that's not what the discussion is about. The discussion is about saying, we're going to stop you thinking about the rate of profit by labelling you as inequality deniers. Just another ploy. With no fault for it.
Oh, yeah,
We're wrapping
We're
up.
wrapping
It's been
up.
10 minutes over. I would
Yeah.
agree. It's worth it.